Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, good evening, or good night, depending on where you are. You are very, very welcome to this virtual open house at the International Commission on Missing Persons headquarters in The Hague, Netherlands. This event is part of the City of The Hague's Just Peace Month, and we're really excited about it. My name is Susanna, and I will be the moderator throughout today's event. We're very glad to have participants, both from the Netherlands and from all corners of the world. Our program today has three parts. First, our Director-General, Kathryne Bomberger, will give an introduction. And after that, my colleagues Angelica and Goran will talk about the important role families play in accounting for missing persons. And then we'll pop into the lab and my colleague John will show us what really happens there. So now let's get started. Director General, are you ready and with us? Is she coming? Here. Sorry. Welcome.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you, everyone, and welcome to the international headquarters or virtual headquarters of the International Commission on Missing Persons. As Susanna said, this is an open house that has traditionally been provided to people in The Hague, but given the pandemic, we're extending the invitation virtually to people around the world, and I understand that we have quite a number of people joining us today from different parts of the world. So the focus of this presentation today will be about the issue of missing persons, obviously, but with a focus on what ICMP is and what ICMP does. So without further ado, I'd also like to welcome my colleague, Sanne Vanderscores, who will be helping me provide the presentation, which will be a PowerPoint presentation. Okay. That's great. Okay. If we could go to the first slide, please. Okay. This picture I decided to use to open today's discussion about the work of ICMP, and in particular, the relevance of the issue of missing persons. And we'll discuss at length what the issue is, how it's dealt with internationally under international law. But it's very important first to understand the trauma that many families of the missing around the world are going through. And the numbers are really in the missing, and we'll describe the demographics of the issue. But governments, especially families of the missing, who have missing persons as a consequence of being forcibly disappeared. In other words, under circumstances where state actors or other political actors were responsible for abducting an individual, torturing them and executing them, or other cases where even non-state actors were involved, such as persons involved in organized crime, human trafficking, and human slavery. This is recognized as a form of mental torture for the family because they live in a state of limbo. They don't know where their loved ones are. They don't know if they're alive or if they're deceased, what the circumstances were, who the perpetrator may have been. So they live in this sense of limbo, in this state of uncertainty, which, as I said, is understood to be a form of torture. So ensuring that the rights of families are secured is the primary function of ICMP, and I'll describe how we work. This particular photograph shows a woman from Bosnia-Herzegovina where ICMP did spend a lot of time and was at the habit for a period of time with many of the families from the former Yugoslavia who then lived as refugees in Europe. They would often try to recreate pictures of the way they were using photoshopped images of the family and then inserting within the picture a member of the family who had gone missing, the way they once looked, and using a contemporary photograph of the individuals from the family. So it's heartbreaking to see this, but I think this type of picture really demonstrates the agony that families go through and the desire to retain the memory of that person. And this really is a cornerstone of everything that we do involving missing persons cases, and families of the missing are the center of our work. And what we're trying to do at ICMP is to ensure that families of the missing are the center of work by states. If we could go to the next slide, please, Sonia. So demographically, you're probably wondering how many people are missing in the world and what are the circumstances of their disappearance? Well, in fact, we don't know. Because even though the issue itself is as old as mankind, people have gone missing for the various causes listed here for many, many years, for decades, in fact, maybe going back as far back as the Stone Ages. But dealing with the issue, addressing the issue is a relatively new phenomenon. So we're now really beginning to understand that phenomenon. We're beginning to understand, in other words, the challenge of missing persons and the variety of circumstances missing persons go missing under. As we all know, people are missing from wars, and this might constitute the largest number of missing persons. And there are many ongoing conflicts around the world that are resulting in missing persons cases. I mean, we can look at Syria today, other conflicts, and also Colombia, where persons have gone missing and they're still missing. Sadly, there are still cases of missing persons even after the peace agreement, which ended a 50-year conflict. There are also people missing as a consequence of human rights abuses. And in this category, we would, of course, include cases of persons that were forcibly disappeared. There is an international convention. It's called the International Convention on the Protection of Persons from Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances, which went into effect in 2010 in the world. And it deals with, and it defines how states should respond to cases of missing persons, which we'll get into later. Persons are also missing from organized violence, including human trafficking and human slavery. They're also missing from disasters around the world, floods, earthquakes, tsunamis. They're also missing from migration. And today that is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. Also, we might argue that it's not becoming a bigger problem. It could be that we're, for the first time in history, recognizing it as a real challenge. Next slide, please. But who are these missing people? We're also beginning to understand the demographics of who they are. And what we're finding within the last about 3 decades is that the majority of those missing are men. And this happens to be the case whether they're missing from armed conflict, whether they're missing from human rights abuses, organized crime, and migration. And we are increasingly being able to determine this using scientific certitude, especially using DNA. So the majority of missing are men. That doesn't mean that women are not also targeted in cases of enforced disappearance. And this can be the case, for example, of Daesh crimes or in Mexico or other locations. For example, in Canada today, the majority of missing are First Nations women. And this means that these cases have not been properly investigated in Canada, which is very nice, is beginning to take this on board and to address this challenge. So the majority are men, but of course there are cases where women are specifically targeted. In addition, when we're talking about persons missing from conflict, they're largely civilians. And this is a phenomenon that really changed over the last century. If we look at World War I, for example, the majority of persons who were killed or disappeared or whose whereabouts were unknown following the end of the conflict were largely combatants. In the conflicts of the former Yugoslavia, the ratio was turned on its head, and actually the majority of individuals who went missing were civilians. And that's a trend that we're also seeing in Syria. When we're talking about migrants and others who go missing and minorities, they tend to be poor. So who are the survivors then? When we're talking about securing human rights, when we're talking about reinstating or reinforcing the rule of law, who is it? Who are the living? Who are the living survivors? They tend to be women. And I think that's a very important thing to remember. And I think that has framed the way we have historically dealt with this issue of missing persons. Because the majority of those survivors were women, the way we looked at this issue has also changed over time. And I would argue it had been largely ignored for a long time because the majority of those who are asking the questions were women. Next slide, please. The approach has changed over time. Earlier in time, let's say over 200 years ago, over 150 years ago, there were no organized efforts to find missing persons. Searching for missing persons usually took place as part of ad hoc efforts. For example, the company that owned the Titanic was responsible for putting efforts together to find survivors or to deal with the remnants of the Titanic. So it could be companies, it could be others, but it was really largely ad hoc. With the creation of the Geneva Conventions and in international humanitarian law, you begin to see a different approach, where for the first time with Florence Nightingale and others, you're looking at now the conflict situations where persons are missing during armed conflict. And we are now through the Geneva Conventions trying to ensure that warring parties protect persons from disappearing during armed conflict, and that they share information regarding possible cases of missing persons, and that they treat the dead with dignity. In the 1990s, we began to see yet another change, and that is the creation of the international criminal courts here in The Hague, where ICMP is headquartered, and the emergence of a rule of law process and applying that to missing persons cases, where for the first time we're recognizing that persons are missing from a variety of causes, usually, if not pretty much always, linked to criminal circumstances, and that perpetrators should be held to account, those perpetrators who are responsible for disappearing missing persons. And so you can see that with the creation of the International Criminal Court for the former Yugoslavia, its counterpart for Rwanda, and finally the establishment of the International Criminal Court in 1998. Also moving on in time, even the response to disasters, if you look at the way there was a response to the tsunami, which occurred at the very end of 2004, the response in 2005 to find those who went missing and those who were dead was largely orchestrated by law enforcement and under the auspices of Interpol. So that really is a dramatic shift now from what used to happen, from ad hoc efforts to humanitarian efforts, to a rule of law approach, where we have a different understanding of the responsibility of states and securing the rights of the living. Thank you. Next slide. So what are the underlying principles? ICMP was created in 1996, and I'll get into this in a second. And so we've been able to analyze the situation for a very long time, and our mandate, as I'll demonstrate later, is to ensure the cooperation of governments. The Convention on the Protection of Persons from Enforced Disappearance also defines the responsibility of states, and the treaty that eventually was the cornerstone of ICMP's ability to carry on its work also defines the responsibility of states. But what are those responsibilities? In 2014, we brought together the governments in the former Yugoslavia to analyze what were the circumstances which led to accounting for such a high number of missing persons. And we began to define how the state itself dealt with finding missing persons, what were the institutional mechanisms that they built, the legislation that was created that underpinned the effort to find missing persons regardless of their ethnic, religious, or national origin, or the circumstances of their disappearance. And in 2014, the governments in the Western Balkans signed a declaration on the responsibility of states to address missing persons cases from armed conflict and human rights abuses. Then in 2018, ICMP decided to take that declaration and extend it during the Paris Peace Conference, and extend it to all cases of missing persons, not just those cases of missing persons from armed conflict and human rights abuses, but also missing persons cases from migration, from organized crime, and other circumstances. So this is a list of some of those principles, and if you would like the document itself, we'll be happy to send it to you. Next slide. So ICMP, as I said earlier, was initially created in 1996 at a G7 summit, and it was created initially to deal with the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia. Those conflicts resulted in about 160,000 deaths and 40,000 cases of missing persons. Now, the people that established ICMP in 1996, that included Cyrus Vance, Lord Bandater, felt that having high numbers of missing persons would be an impediment to reestablishing peace and security in the region. So they created this commission under the auspices. Then it was actually an initiative that came from President Clinton at the G7 summit. They created a standalone commission to deal with missing persons cases, initially in the former Yugoslavia. So when ICMP was created, Our mandate, which you can see here, which is held up through time, which was to secure the cooperation of governments, at that point was limited to the temporal time period of the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia and to the region of the former Yugoslavia. By 2003, following our engagement with other governments and also begin the fact that we began addressing Kosovo, which of course is in the Western Balkans, and then following the invitation from the EU to assist in efforts regarding Southeast Asia and the tsunami, our set of activities were extended. And discussions began about ICMP becoming a permanent international organization or intergovernmental organization under international law. Now, ICMP had always been equivalent to an intergovernmental organization. So when we established our headquarters agreement with the government of Bosnia-Herzegovina, ICMP was already referred to as an intergovernmental organization, and we enjoyed privileges and immunities, which allowed us, and this is very important, to begin a massive data collection effort, which resulted in assisting the governments in that region finding a large number of missing persons. And we'll get into that as well later. In 2014, following a lot of political efforts globally, the Dutch government took the initiative to form a working group where other governments were invited to provide ICMP with an international governmental legal status. And that treaty now, which is also available on our website, provided ICMP with privileges and immunities in The Hague following a headquarters agreement with the government of the Netherlands, and allowed us to grow globally and to work globally. And the next slide will show you how we do that. And it also very importantly, and this is important in the context of the convention, ICMP was mandated through this treaty not only to address missing persons cases in line with the convention, which again are only looking at cases of enforced disappearance, but also cases of missing persons from other circumstances, from migration, from organized crime, from disasters. So ICMP itself is looking at the full gamut of missing persons cases. So when ICMP became a treaty-based intergovernmental organization, its historic commissioners, who had been part of ICMP for a long time, and many of you, of course, in the Netherlands will know Wim Kok, the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, who sadly passed away recently. He became one of ICMP's commissioners in 2003. The set of commissioners became a board of commissioners. And through the process of, through the treaty, a Conference of State Parties was created so that all states who were originally signatory states, the period of signature on the treaty ended in 2016, became members of the Conference of State Parties once the treaty was ratified in their states. Now the treaty is open to accession, so a number of states have come on board through the accession process, and the treaty is now open to all states for accession. So the treaty has a board of commissioners. The treaty talks about a board of commissioners, which is the governing body of the commission, and also the Conference of State Parties, which includes those states that are either signatory states to the ICMP treaty or members of the ICMP treaty. There's also a Director-General, which is me, and there's a financial committee, which reports to the Conference of State Parties. So that's the structure itself. Now, it's very important because we've asked a number of states to accede to the treaty, and this is important for ICMP. We're in The Hague, we're often perceived as a Western organization, and we want to let go of that mantle. We want to be perceived as an international organization. So there are a number of states from Latin America, from Europe, and other parts of the world who have become members of the ICMP Conference of State Parties. But we want to extend that membership to all states, and that will make us stronger. And becoming part of ICMP also means that there's an understanding on the part of the state that accedes to the treaty that we're entering a new era in terms of searching for missing persons, one that is in line with state responsibility and in line with the rule of law, where families of the missing will have their rights secured by states for justice, truth, and reparations. Next slide. ICMP doesn't work by itself. We're a relatively small organization. We hover around, I don't know, 150 to 180 staff. It depends on our grants, and I'll get into that also. So we work with a number of other organizations, and here you'll see me signing an agreement with the former Secretary-General of Interpol. We also have agreements with IOM. We have an agreement with the ICC, with the ICTY previously, with the Kosovo Specialist Chamber, with the Netherlands Forensic Institute. So we maintain a number of cooperation agreements with a number of international organizations. In 2016, at the UN General Assembly, we also launched an interagency committee on missing persons. Again, ICMP being the only international organization or intergovernmental organization that's mandated now to deal with this issue. We've also extended an invitation to other international organizations, from IOM to ICRC to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and others, to form an interagency committee so that we can work more effectively together as international organizations to find missing persons. And this is critical, for example, in dealing with missing migrants in Europe and in the Mediterranean. So this is a very important concept, so that we join forces, and together, of course, we're stronger. Next slide, please. Within ICMP, we have a set of programs, and these programs quite literally come from how we help states. Again, remembering that our mandate is to ensure the cooperation of governments. So how do we help states, once the political will is exhibited to address this issue, how do we help states build the capacity to do so? So we teased from the principles that I showed you earlier, and the sort of a practical understanding of the work that we have been doing for over 2 decades, and put together a set of programs that have logically been working now for a period of time to assist states in becoming accountable for finding missing persons. So one of our programs is called Institutional and Legislative Development. And here we work with states to build their institutional capacity, to develop domestic legislation that will assist in securing the rights of families of the missing. We also try to help states implement, those states that, of course, have signed the Convention on the Protection of Persons from Involuntary Disappearance, in creating, implementing legislation so that is harmonized within their domestic legislation. And this is really key to building a state's capacity. We also work directly with a number of civil society groups, including, very importantly, families of the missing. And we try to take disparate groups of families of the missing to help them build their capacity, to turn them into associations of families of the missing, into vibrant civil society organizations, or to connect them with existing human rights organizations or other civil society organizations, so that they can unite on the issue of missing persons, and again, with the philosophy that they too are stronger if they are united. And this is particularly the case in many of the governments or areas that we work in. If the families are united across ethnic, religious, and national lines, they are stronger and more capable of influencing a process within the state. And as we often say to the families, they are much stronger than they think. And that is the case in many societies where we're working in. So we try to build those efforts, and we use various tools to do so. We've also developed, over the last couple decades, a really unique and amazing data system capability. So one of our programs is called Data Systems and Data Coordination. And I would welcome you to see this. That's not going to be part of today's presentation, where you're going to see the lab, but this is critical. Having a centralized data system capability is absolutely essential to finding people, and I will also get into that. We also use advanced scientific and technological means to help states find missing persons and to identify them. So you'll see later on a presentation from one of my colleagues from the DNA laboratory. ICMP maintains a standing capacity to use its DNA laboratory to help states around the world who have missing persons from the circumstances I outlined earlier. Now, using advanced DNA technology is something that ICMP is really well known for. We took a risk in the former Yugoslavia 2 decades ago to apply DNA to large-scale missing persons cases. This had never been done before, and it worked. And the cost has been lowered now, but getting this, using this technology does depend on various factors. It does depend on having strong institutions, legislation in place that also secures the rights of families of the missing and can protect data, including the privacy of data of families of the missing. So all of these programs work together to help states build capacity to find missing persons. Next slide, please. So what we're trying to do in each one of these cases, now taking these programs and operationalizing them, so to speak, is we're always trying to reinforce the rule of law. And I think some of you might be here from the Asser Institute, but last week we gave a presentation about memory. And one of the key components here is that finding missing persons is, must be done in accordance with the rule of law. So states must investigate missing persons cases in line with the rule of law. In most Western countries, in Europe and North America, this would happen. However, there are cases even in Western countries where this is not happening. And that's largely the case when you're dealing with minority groups or migrants. For example, as I said earlier, Europe now has the highest number of dead and missing migrants in the world. So states should be responsible for finding not only citizens, but non-citizens. In the rest of the world, the situation is even more complicated. And often, there are no strong rule of law mechanisms in place, obviously, in certain cases. So building that capacity is critical so that families can secure their rights to justice, truth, and reparations. And we believe that there needs to be an end to the existing double standard, and that reinforcing the rule of law in missing persons cases should be uniformly applied throughout the world. Next slide. This also means that good governance capabilities must be built within the state. This is a picture of the signing ceremony of the Missing Persons Institute, or the creation of the Missing Persons Institute in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Now, the Missing Persons Institute was signed, the creation began in 2005, and that institution is hugely important in what was a fractured society as a consequence of the conflict there. It allowed the states to find all missing persons, regardless of their religious or national background or the circumstances of their disappearance. So that the state does this is critical. So the state itself must engage in proper investigations, regardless of the circumstances or ethnic, religious, or political background of the person that's being searched for. So building these institutions is critical. We're trying to do the same thing in Iraq currently. The numbers in Iraq are staggering. And currently Iraq has a number of institutions that are tasked with searching for missing persons. So creating one institution that is responsible for finding all missing persons and securing the rights of all families of the missing is critical. And of course, creating the underpinning legislation to be able to do this is very important. For example, we also helped Iraq in creating a law on mass grave affairs, which defines again what the structure would be, both institutional and legal, to conduct excavations of mass grave sites. So we're building on that particular law to create a national center. And I'm just using these examples. I mean, this is happening in many of the programs that we're engaged in. Next slide, please. We're also trying to ensure that states secure human rights. And as I said earlier, we're dealing with missing persons cases where we're securing the rights of the living. Those who are dead, we honor them, we respect them, and there are measures in place, and ICRC works on this to ensure the dignity of the dead, and these things are extremely important. However, securing the rights of those survivors, who are primarily women and children, is critical to the process of truth, to justice, to effective investigations, to reparations, as well as to expressions of commemoration. So securing those rights equally for all is what states must do. Next slide. Part of this requires effective investigations in line with the rule of law, as I said earlier. So these investigations should be done by law enforcement, prosecutors, judicial authorities. Families of the missing can, of course, participate and should be there with the permission of prosecutors, because these are crime scenes. So being able to document these crime scenes properly so that evidence can be provided to a level where evidence could be provided to an international court is a standard to which we are providing training, for example. Now, that doesn't always mean that evidence collected at a crime scene will go to court because of the numbers of cases when we're talking about a place like Colombia or a place like Syria or many other parts of the world. The numbers or Iraq, the numbers are so high that it may not be possible to excavate all mass graves, and it may not be possible to provide evidence of the information that was collected at a mass grave in criminal trials. For example, in the former Yugoslavia, not all cases went to court. But what is important is to be able to excavate those sites to that level so that there is the possibility that one day they could go to court. Now, this picture shows the same site before it was excavated and after it was excavated. And this also becomes important for memorial purposes. For example, in Bosnia, there's a law established to commemorate the location of mass grave sites. So this is complicated, but what's for sure, and that gets into a zone that does become politically complicated, but states have to think about this, but for sure, when one goes to a crime scene, which could be a mass or other kind of clandestine grave, proper excavations to that level are critical to securing the rights of families of the missing. Next slide, please. Also, when you're trying to build the state's capacities, as I described earlier, you can create commissions on missing persons because the issue is often cross-cutting and involves several ministries, from justice to health to international, the ministries of foreign affairs. So creating centralized institutions like the Missing Persons Institute or the National Center at Iraq are very important. Conducting excavations in line with the rule of law. These bodies can also coordinate that process. But those bodies that I described should also be the holder of central records. And this may seem obvious, but most states do not have just a central record of who went missing. And this goes back to the earlier point of why we don't know how many people are missing globally, because most states have not conducted effective investigations into missing persons cases, so the numbers are actually unknown. So creating these centralized records becomes important. So these central records should hold all data, from data that is collected from the missing person, about the missing person, including what they look like, the circumstances of their disappearance, when they disappeared, who disappeared them, where they disappeared, but also information that can be gleaned from the crime scene when there's an excavation, from the mortuary if that person is again dead, if the person is alive. There could be information, for example, of a trafficked child in Greece, or other location. I'm just simply using Greece as an example because there are children that have been in detention that are coming from various parts of the world. In other words, they could be alive, they've been separated from their parents for a while, they may need to be reconnected with them, so having central records is key. Now, this is a file system, this is an old system that ICMP was maintaining. All of this data is now available in electronic form, and that electronic form is what we've built over the years. So keeping this data in a centralized repository in electronic form so that the dots can be connected and missing persons cases can be investigated is absolutely essential to finding missing persons. For example, in the case of Srebrenica, where 8,000 Muslim men and boys were executed in a matter of days, we were able to now help Bosnia and Herzegovina find almost 90% of the 8,000 men and boys who went missing. But through our centralized data system capability, where we collected data from all families of the missing across the former Yugoslavia, we were able to connect the identity of the person back to the crime scene. In the case of Srebrenica, several crime scenes, because bodies were moved from primary locations to multiple secondary locations. So having these centralized data systems become important, but it's important that states hold these systems. That's also important for providing accurate and reliable information to citizens. And that's important for avoiding fake news or national or information that could be put together or given to citizens that doesn't reflect accurate information. So having accurate and reliable information about the missing person from the crime scene, from all the circumstances under which a person goes missing, is critical to finding a person and to accurately reporting back to the families of the missing what the circumstances were when they were found or where they are in the process of finding a missing person. Next slide, please. Now, John Tonkin will get into this later, but using advanced scientific means is also important. But for those of you who are non-scientists, let me explain it a little bit differently. When you collect data from families of the missing, you're collecting data, as I said earlier, about the missing person, about the person who reported them missing. But it's also important to collect, in this modern age, DNA information or genetic information or reference samples from families of the missing. Now, this can be collected using a saliva swab, but it can also be collected using a blood reference sample. And in certain cases where we've worked, primarily in the Western Balkans, providing a blood reference sample became a very powerful symbol of searching for somebody that you love. You were giving a piece of yourself to find that missing person. And that follows memory, that follows the generations of people who are still searching for that missing person. ICMP is just starting a program, for example, in Vietnam. The Vietnamese are searching for people who went missing now in the 1970s. There are cases of persons missing earlier in time from other conflicts. So there are still people alive, the Spanish Civil War, that still, this issue of missing haunts them. So providing a bit of yourself through DNA is a very human process of finding somebody that you love. It's also a very democratizing process. As ICMP was able to demonstrate in the context of the former Yugoslavia, we collected data from 100,000 families of the missing. That meant every single family of the missing had an opportunity to provide data about themselves, regardless of their national, ethnic, religious origin, or the circumstances under which that person went missing. Everyone was provided the opportunity to voluntarily provide data to find a missing person. Next slide, please. Securing effective remedies, and this is critical, and this is often very difficult, and this process can actually be quite politicized, but ensuring that families of the missing, who are primarily women, maintain custody of their children is critical. I mean, needless to say, I don't need to go into that, but believe it or not, that is often not the case. Sometimes women whose husbands have disappeared in circumstances where they cannot for sure say that the person is dead, that they're living in this limbo where they're disappeared and they don't know what happened to them. These women cannot claim custody rights, they cannot claim inheritance rights. So it's absolutely essential that we deal with this issue. In some cases, governments have issued a declaration of absence, for example, to allow them to secure rights. But I think we're really in a nascent stage right now in terms of how to get the governments to provide effective remedies to families of the missing. Because clearly, I mean, at the moment, providing those remedies is often based on the circumstances of the disappearance, which means if the majority of missing persons are women, that also means that they're being compensated based on the circumstances of the disappearance of their husbands. And clearly that has to stop. There should be a way to do this in a more impartial way. Next slide. So ICMP also maintains a very vibrant program with families of the missing. I'm not going to go into great detail about that. This is a picture of an event we had, well, a while ago in The Hague. My colleagues, Angelica and Goran, will give you a very good presentation about ICMP's civil society initiatives work. Next slide, please. We also recently launched the Wimcock Center of Excellence in Learning. I'm just showing you a picture here of a training that we provided recently to families of the missing from Syria here at headquarters in February this year. We're increasingly doing this online now in different parts of the world. The training that we provide, or learning and development that we provide, programs that we provide include learning and development in the use of DNA technologies, advanced technologies, which we're providing in Mexico, Colombia, Iraq, and different locations. It also provides crime scene management, forensic archaeology, and anthropology. We also provide learning and development programs directly for families of the missing, so that they understand the process. And in other words, we would provide them the same type of background information we're providing you today. So this center is very important. And it's not only a center where we're providing training programs or learning and development programs, but it's also a center or a knowledge center where we're also housing knowledge. So we also want to share a reference library of information we have about institutions that exist globally that states have created, or legislation that has been created globally, so that we can share this with others, including families of the missing. Next slide. I'm not going to get into great detail here because I think we're running out of time, but we have worked in 40 countries around the world. The most prominent example is the work that we did in the Western Balkans. And right now there is a missing persons group in the Western Balkans that represents the states of the former Yugoslavia that were engaged in the conflicts in the 1990s. And they are now responsible for finding the remaining 12,000 missing persons cases. But what was achieved in that region is unprecedented, and it really does serve as a model for what other states can do to find missing persons after conflict. Next slide, please. We've also engaged in other areas that are emerging from conflict, human rights abuses or organized crime, and these are a list of these states. Or in the case of Norway, we were dealing again with missing persons cases from World War II. Next slide. We've also helped a number of states following disasters. This has been a number of these states. It was really a privilege to work with Thailand and the Maldives, as well as the Philippines, on these very tough cases. But sadly, with Haiyan, there are quite a number of people still missing. Next slide, please. These are other areas where we've worked on disasters. We're also assisting the government of the Netherlands with identifying the last two remaining passengers of MH17, which John will get into in the next slide. We've also offered assistance to Beirut following the explosion. So we do have a disaster victim identification platform. We often deploy with Interpol to respond to disasters. Next slide. And as I said earlier, we're also working on cases of missing persons who are migrants or refugees. And of course, this is a global problem. I just highlighted the situation in Europe because Europe currently has the highest number of missing persons, but this is an issue across the world. That's it for me. So thank you for the virtual tour of ICMP. I hope this was beneficial to you. Has provided you with information, and I would really like to see some of you again. If you have questions, you are welcome to come to our headquarters at some point, but it's been a pleasure to give you this presentation.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to move on to the second part of our program here. It's another very exciting and interesting point. My colleagues Angelica and Goran will talk about the important role of families in accounting for the missing. So Angelica and Goran, please join the stage.
Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Goran Batic and I'm Program Officer with ICMP.
Good afternoon. My name is Angelica Aparicio, and I also work at the International Commission on Missing Persons, ICMP.
I come from Bosnia and Herzegovina, a country that was affected by the missing persons issue during the war in the early 90s, leaving approximately 30,000 persons unaccounted for.
And I come from Colombia. It's a beautiful country in South America. In my country, we have had an armed conflict involving numerous guerrillas, irregular armed force, organized crime, and the state. This armed conflict has lasted over 50 years and have left approximately 120,000 missing persons. One of the guerrillas, the FARC, and the government signed a peace agreement in 2016, but other armed groups continue operating. We are both very pleased to benefit from your interest in the work of ICMP and in the issue of missing persons. So let's get started.
As our Director-General explained earlier in her presentation, the pillars for an effective effort to account for missing persons are state action, evidence in legislation, institutions, political will and coordination, a technical and scientific approach to manage cases of missing persons, and most importantly, the participation of families of the missing. At ICMP, both Angelica and I work directly with families of the missing and civil society organizations. In the next 30 minutes, we will walk you through the many examples to illustrate how families of the missing are at the very center of the process of accounting for missing persons. We will cover three topics: Together, we will hear from families of the missing from many different parts of the world as to what it means to have a missing relative. We will start with the horrid pain of disappearance, but we'll also go beyond that. We will share with you examples of incredible resilience and power, and we will witness their journeys from communal victimhood to becoming strong human rights defenders. Most importantly, we will hear about what they demand from the authorities. We will also tell you how ICMP works with families of the missing. At the end of the presentation, we will answer your questions, of course. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please post them in the question box.
Exactly. So by the end of these 30 minutes, we hope you will leave touched, inspired, and informed about how to support families of the missing, many of which are very possibly around you, even here in the Netherlands.
Before we get started, let's look at some of the very important facts. First, disappearances happen in different contexts: armed conflict, human rights abuses, natural or human-made disasters, action of organized crime, and irregular migration. And when such disappearances happen, they happen in large numbers. We invite you to imagine all these different contexts, but also to remember what is common to the families of the missing.
Yes. As a second fact, men and women and children disappear, and their disappearance impacts them differently. Also, some groups are more at risk of disappearances. When it comes to human trafficking, for example, women and children are most vulnerable. When it comes to armed conflict, men are those who majorly go missing. The disappearance has a huge impact on the family of the disappeared, and those who get mobilized are often women. So working on the issue of participation of families of the missing, we are mostly talking about ensuring that women can become community leaders.
Third, when persons disappear, sometimes they will be found alive. They're probably lost or illegally detained and impaired from being reunited with their families. But other times, they may not be found alive. This is particularly the case of disappearances in the context of armed conflict and human rights violations. When speaking about the issue of missing persons, we should remember that families of the missing may assume or imagine what happened to their relatives, especially if a long time has passed since the disappearance. But they cannot be sure until they know with certainty, and they always hope for the families to return.
Yes, Goran, we should also remember that state has an obligation to search for missing persons in all possible manners. And until a person is not proven to be dead, their disappearance should be treated considering all hypotheses, and the families should be treated respecting and considering the impact of this ambiguity. These three facts, how disappearances happen, the gender element of disappearance, and the issue of ambiguity, opens the door to explore our first topic, how the issue of the missing affects families who are left behind. So please, Sasha, can you play the first video?
And before we play the video, just an introduction as to this topic. When a person goes missing, the surviving family is affected in all spheres of their lives. Imagine what would happen if someone in your family went missing. What would be the impacts? There is the emotional impact. The missing relative is psychologically present but physically absent. Your relative is missing, yet you do not know if the relative is alive or dead. Are they safe? Are they hurt? Do you mourn or do you hope? These questions accompany families every second of their lives for days, years, and decades, creating an eternal anguish. Families with the missing often tell authorities, for you, looking my relative takes months. For me, every minute is an entire year.
There's also this economic impact. As we discussed, in the context of armed conflict, the majority of those who go missing are men. In traditional societies, men are often the main breadwinners of the family. When the father or the son goes missing, families are left behind with no income. In many traditional societies, women have as well limited opportunities to join the workforce, and if they do so, there is no structure to support single-headed households.
In the midst of so much pain, can they manage to be both productive and focused on searching for their missing relatives? Would you show up for work if a family of yours went missing?
Yes, Goran, this is extremely difficult for families of the missing to continue a normal life. They need to balance securing their subsistence with devoting time to search for their relative. They need to go as well to the authorities, and this often requires long and expensive travel. They demand action, follow up with information. For example, joining a march, meeting other family members. All these activities are not only costly, but they are also detracting time from productive or recreational activities.
On top of that, there are legal implications to a disappearance that also have economic and social consequences. The sheer fact that one cannot prove their missing relative is dead bars them from accessing their rights. For instance, the disappeared person stops receiving a salary and benefits, but because they are not legally dead, their financial obligations such as debts continue. Their relatives cannot claim insurance or pension. Their relatives cannot dispose of the property or access inheritance.
And actually, this legal issue goes beyond financial. A disappearance means for many women that they lose the custody of their children, or it means that the surviving family member cannot marry again. And in many traditional societies, unmarried women face additional societal and economical disadvantages. As women and other surviving family members need to face the emotional, financial, and legal implication of the disappearance, they also need to tend to their children. In more traditional societies, they do not have authority to lead the family, and therefore family disintegration is very common.
Now think of the security impact. Disappearances are often caused by crimes, which put family members at risk of also disappearing. When they search for their missing relatives and ask questions, they are also under threat. Authorities often take advantage of their desperation, making them subject to bribes and extortion. Family members are also stigmatized. People think of, well, if there must be a reason why a family member disappeared, and they're ostracized, marginalized, and socially accused. These situations exacerbate the pain of the disappearance, impacting their mental and physical health.
And there's one additional fact. These vulnerabilities are exacerbated, especially if the state that is supposed to protect them denies the disappearance and fails to act. Many countries around the world have missing persons problems, and in a very large majority of the thousands of people are in the situation described above by Kathryne and me. Please allow us to play 2 videos from our country programs in Iraq and in Colombia that illustrate the effects of disappearances of the surviving family members in their own words. So Sasha, let's play the first video, please.
الاب عمود البيت. عمود البيت راح، يعني احنا افتقدنا اعز واغلى شيء عندنا.
برايكم يقصى الله خون بشكتور بو يعني شو روش بيك وابوين اجا بروش تاين بو ناو كولان بروين بو دروا
بيرهاتنت خشكة مواقع هافال بونجي شمرة وخويشك بونجي المال دشمرة الشهر دو جاز قالك غريب
اطفاله محتاجين، انا محتاجته، يعني هواية تعبنا من بعده، هواية تعبنا من بعده.
منو بابن بيك بابرا بديني بتري براي مني هاري كتشكتر حمري وسي سالبون بابي مش همو تشتي بترح شويتكر داعش اوج دستي مداراني اش مبرن و 5 سالة او تشتي هاري بتريكش جي غريب بوي واسبيت شاوته.
اتمنى يكون موجود ويرجع لعائلته والبيت لحبابه.
بروش تاي بو هرجيك ابويا دسي من لقل دسي ابويا ايود فرهاد نابي ولا من دورو بكيوتو شكو تو عزيزتني كتمي.
بعد 2007 بعد ما راح شفنا العذاب، يعني العذاب بانواعه. إلا امكانيتنا صفر، كانت الامكانيه صفر. 1 2 البحث عنه بدون انقطاع بكل الاتجاهات، سنوات طويله واحنا نبحث.
يعني لو انا مشتاق مبيره كاتي خوي شكرة ترجبو بيانو لولاتي يمكن شكرة ترج أم نقلة ترشجانة خوش بوكي سنبو يعني هش كاتي بهاتايا أبوي كيسي كتايبتي بوي ما بس أنا أيود بوي من على كانم بيبش نوم لو نازو نعمتها
هكاد بيان نيرو خوش كبران همو طالبين مدرسة أبو يكجينا مالي وقتت بيان نيرو وقتت بيا إيفار هروسا بري همو المال ده فيقرد عايشين يكشما نبو يغايب يفاري المال نهم نينم.
هو راح صارت المسؤولية كلها علي أنا أتعب عليهم، أنا أهتم بهم بدراستهم وبحياتهم.
بحقات شوان لخوا يعني بينين بروج البرون هرجيا جا أجمل هرجيا جا كابم يكي بانجي دايكي بكا مني أقصد المرأة شركة منو آوات أوام جاري كل دايكم ببينم برم داير تخواكي جاري كده أو شكله تشون بناسيني.
Yo busco a mi mamá. Mi mamá es Norma Constanza Guerra Forero.
Bueno, yo busco a Leonardo Gómez Cortés y a Luis Miguel Gómez Cortés.
Busco a lo que se llevaron de mi esposo. Busco a los desaparecidos.
Yo busco al sargento del ejército, el sargento Rojas Rincón José Vicente.
Para mí es muy difícil hablar de esto porque yo era una niña muy pequeña. Tenía 2 años y la búsqueda comenzó cuando empecé a captar que ella no estaba.
Esos momentos de compañía, de fortalezas, siempre estuvieron al pie mío.
Siempre que llegaba, nos sentábamos a escuchar, a reír.
Era un excelente chef, le fascinaba cocinar.
No tengo recuerdos precisamente porque era una niña muy pequeña, entonces se podría decir que me arrebataron los recuerdos de mi mamá, me los quitaron.
Con Leonardo sus juegos y con Lucho compartimos el dolor de la pérdida de Leonardo, pero también la lucha por encontrarlo, la lucha del dolor, pero la lucha también de la resistencia.
In the 2 videos, we heard from 7 brave persons. They come from very different countries in the world. They speak about the disappearance that happened across 40 decades, from 1983 to 2014. Yet the message coming from them point to the commonalities of the impact onto the surviving family members. Ms. Rami from Baghdad, Iraq, talks about the change of the roles. The entire household responsibility falls on the shoulders of the mother, and her roles have all of a sudden completely shifted without having the safety net to fall onto. Women are often left behind as sole providers, along with the newly acquired roles of being responsible to deal with the administrative and often painful procedures of looking for their missing relatives. Families have to start anew, no income, no family figures. There is a significant impact also stemming from the fees families pay in certain countries pertaining to legal aid. The more destitute the families are, the more prone they are to financial manipulation. Ms. Debbie Amaya from Colombia and Mr. Farhad Rashid Amin from Iraq indicate how removing a family figure from one's life impacts the way we remember them. And the process of looking for their relatives remains the centrality of their lives. They look for their missing relatives every day. Every action strives towards one objective. Ms. Shada, the young Yazidi woman whose 7 family members went missing as a result of crimes committed by Daesh on the mountain of Sinjar in August 2014. That example in particular indicates what this crime can do in relation to families, communities, and security. Following the 2014 genocide, many Yazidi families fled the country to seek safety elsewhere. It also points to the break of the social fabric. The sense of community and everyday rituals are broken. Statements of Ms. Gloria, Ms. Pilar, and Ms. Esperanza indicate the loss of safety net and mutual support. There is no one left to share the pain with. Yet, despite the pain and loss, hope remains, and these forces know no boundaries. Our work at ICMP is to ensure that first and foremost, authorities act upon their obligation to look for missing persons. We also work in changing legislation and institutions to ensure that families receive adequate support, aid, and legal protection. So what happens after? In spite of this pain, and because of this pain, families are transformed. Let's look at the next topic, their journey to realize their rights.
Exactly. Thank you, Goran. So when reflecting about families' journey from victims to realizing their rights, We must bear in mind that families of persons who have gone missing are the central piece of effective processes of accounting for them. How? Okay, they hold key information that will help the state to act. If they do not report a missing person, the state authorities will not know that someone is missing. The families are the ones who possibly last saw the missing persons and will know where the disappearance could have happened. And also, you will see later that DNA is an essential tool for human identification. Without the families providing a blood sample or a buccal swab, it becomes much more difficult to identify someone.
Despite this importance, states often do not reach out to families, or families have no way of knowing what to do. They don't know how to report the disappearance, what information to collect, who to go to. The best support can happen when families come together and share information and experiences. This initial action is then transformed. As seen across all countries in the world, families, most of the times mothers, wives, sisters, and daughters, have come together and have created organized civil society associations that ultimately transform them and expand their role and their own identity, converting the harm they have suffered into agency to secure their rights. While seeking the guarantee to those individual rights to justice, truth, and reparations of each case of missing persons, families have managed to gain expertise, technical knowledge, dedication, and strength that are shared from generation to generation and across different contexts. With this incredible activism, families of the missing go beyond their immediate concern of their specific family members to demand political will. They advocate and demand of the state institutions to undertake genuine and effective investigations.
Yes, and to exemplify this point, the video that we are going to watch next is a sample of shared feelings of ambiguity about the loss faced by families from the Western Balkans, Colombia, and Syria. In one of the videos, we will see Ms. Munira Subachis. She is the president of the movement of the Mothers of Srebrenica and Shepa enclaves, sending a message of support and solidarity to Syrian families of the missing. While circumstances of the disappearances vary, there is always a breaking point that encourages collective action, and this is one of the key messages. As one of the speakers mentioned, one hand cannot clap alone. So let's watch the testimonies, and Sasha, can you please play the second video?
Queremos que se resalte en todas actividades o todos procesos encaminados a trabajar con víctimas de desaparición forzada, resaltar esa resiliencia, ese empoderamiento que venimos teniendo las familias de nuestros seres queridos, porque nosotros somos las voces de ellos, las voces vivientes, de esas voces ausentes por nuestros desaparecidos, ni un minuto de silencio, toda una vida de resistencia y de lucha.
Para enviar un saludo especial y muy sentido de fortaleza en el Día Internacional de la Desaparición Forzada, porque su deber es no olvidarlos y nuestro compromiso es buscar hasta encontrarlos. Muchas gracias. Mi corazón está con ustedes.
البيت طابق تاني، فنكون واقفين على البلكون يقول لي إذا إجوا على البيت لهون لياخذوني، أنا بزت حالي من البلكون وما بخليهم يستلموا.
المشكلة إنه باسل ما اختفى مرة، اختفى كذا مرة. كل مرة بيختفي برجع بعيش وجعين، وجع هاي المرة ووجع اللي قبلها. لا اختفى آخر مرة بال 2015. أول شيء
أنا كنت عم ببحث عن بابا بعالم الأحياء، ما كنت عم ببحث عنه بعالم الأموات أبداً، بس للأسف يعني من 2018 نظام صدر قوائم للأهالي.
Borili smo se na svoj način i borba nikad nije prestala ni posle 25 godina.
Evo i danas se borimo i danas čekamo istinu i danas tražimo pravdu. Međutim, mi odustale nismo. I ja bi zamolila sve sirijske porodice da ne odustaju. Moraju zločinci izaći pred lice pravde. Morate odgajati svoju djecu, kazati im pravu istinu. Mi smo odgojili svoju djecu. Zato vas molim da uradite i vi, da krenete u akciju, da tražite, da ne odustajete, da šaljete na razne adrese pisma, da pitate gdje su vaši najmiliji, zašto ste to doživjeli i da čitav svijet mora to osuditi. Jer mi smo, zato drage moje majke, drage moje sestre, supruge, nemojte stati, uzdajte se u ICMP, zajedno sa Kathryne Bomberger, nemojte odustajati, radite, gradite, pitajte, hodajte, nemojte žaliti svoje vrijeme, nemojte žaliti svoj trud. Allah će vam pomoći, Allah će biti na vašoj strani.
Poruka koju bi ja želio da uputim porodicama koje traže svoje u Siriji je da pokušaju da se udruže, da se utvrdi baza podataka nestalih osoba, da se utiče i na pravosudne organe kako bi i oni pokušali po svom osnovu jednostavno da se traga za nestalim osobama.
والوجع اللي هن موجود عندهم لامس يعني وجعي.
هلا لا شك انه كل شعب كان له تجربته المختلفه او سياقه المختلف، ولكن اخر شيء هي نفس المعاناه، نفس الجريمه صارت اللي هي الاختفاء القسري او الفقدان، وبالتالي شكلت نفس المعاناه. من هي المعاناه فينا نحن نستفيد من تجارب الاخرين شو عملوا، ونحن يعني نكون عم نبتكر السياق يعني المختلف تبعنا.
يعني أنا دائما في عندي جملة ملهمة بالنسبة لي، العدالة لا توهب وإنما تجتزأ اجتزاء، وبتاخديها أخذ. ما حيجي حدا يعطيك إياها على طبق، أنت بدك تسعي وتركضي لأجل تحصلي عليها. أنا بدي يكون صوته صدى صوته لهذا المعتقل، لأنه هو ما له قادر يحكي عن وجعه. فأنا بما إني من أهل هي القضية أنا رح كون صوته طالما صوتي قادر يطلع. صوتي لحالي أنا ما فيه يكون، ما رح يكون له أثر. إيد لوحدها ما بتصفق، فلذلك لما بيجتمع صوتي وصوتك وصوت كل اللي حوالينا وعلى نفس الوجع رح ينسمع الصوت أكثر.
مع بعضنا رح نكون كتير قوايا، ورح نسمع صوتنا بطريقة كتير قوية. رح يكون صوتنا مدوي ومزعج أحيانا لحتى نوصل للي بدنا إياه.
إذا العائلات ما تصرفوا ما حدا رح يقدر يعمل شيء. هي القصة معاناة العائلات، معاناتهم على المستوى العاطفي والاجتماعي والاقتصادي والقانوني. إذا ما هن عملوا شيء أساسا ما حدا رح يعرف إذا في مفقودين ولا لا. الخطوة الأولى لازم العائلات يبلشوها ويتابعوا العائلات مسار كل الخطوات.
ونردد المطلب تبعنا ونضل نكرره ونضل، لأنه ممكن المطلب ما ينفهم من أول مرة. لما بتضلي بتكرري مطلبك بينفهم بالنهاية.
مشان هيك نحن اللي لازم نتصرف، نجمع بعض، نسمع بعض، نفكر سوا شو بدنا نعمل. وهي كتير مهمة إنه نخبر العالم بقصصنا لحتى نلجأ للجهات الصح وللأشخاص الصح والطرق الصح لحتى نوصل للي بدنا إياه.
We felt for the first time that we are alive and we are so free.
أنا بقدر أتفهم خوف العائلات خاصة اللي بقيت بسوريا. العيال بتخاف إنه إذا خبرنا أو عملنا شيء رح ننأذى أو رح ينأذى هذا الشخص. كل حدا بيقدر يلاقي طريقته لحتى يعمل شيء، لأنه الإحساس بالعجز إنه ما عم نقدر نقدم شيء هو كمان كتير بشع. بس أكيد وقت حدا بده أي نصيحة أكيد في جهات هي موثوقة مثل ICMP، وما في شيء رح يكون معلن عنه ويسبب خطر.
ممكن هلأ ناس عم تسمع هذا الكلام اللي أنا عم قوله وتقول ما في حدا عم ينصفنا، ما في حدا واقف جنبنا، نحن شو رح نستفاد؟ بفهم كتير اليأس من القانون، وإنه في كتير قوانين غير منصفة، وإذا كانت منصفة هي غير مطبقة على الأرض. ولكن كتير مهم نتذكر إذا عندي يأس من القانون بده يكون بالمقابل عندي أمل بالحقوق. حقي مشروع، فبيأس من القانون بس ما بيأس من حقي.
Thank you, Sasha. We think that the messages we just saw are extremely powerful. Despite the seemingly different context as a result of the disappearance, families of the missing around the world have to face day by day the ambiguity of their loss, in pair of developing skills to become resilient, to participate in the efforts to search individually for their family members, to become organized and support others and to ultimately become effective advocates of structural changes, which are often needed to solve large numbers of missing persons. So, as part of its mandate, ICMP supports the participation and engagement of families of missing persons by encouraging and supporting families to become organized, and once they are organized, to exchange strategies and jointly develop solutions to address the challenges they are facing in their own country situation. As almost every country facing cases of disappearances is facing as well the breakdown of the social fabric and most likely lack of effective state action, what this group of families do is to contribute to peace and stability building. So how do they do it exactly?
They undertake efforts of political and legal advocacy, for example, by representing individual victims before the state or by engaging constantly with institutions to demand progress in the investigations of their cases. They drive policy processes and push the state to ratify treaties and international instruments, such as the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, the Agreement on the Status and Functions of the ICMP, or to adopt the Paris Principles, a route map of 8 principles which lay out the obligations of governments when addressing the issue of persons going missing. And also, they undertake strategies to raise the public awareness and to commemorate the memory of the relatives. That is why dates such as the 30th of August, which is the International Day of the Disappeared, or any other nationally significant dates, are key for families to call for justice and to ask all of us not to forget what they've been through.
Exactly. So one of the key messages that we really wanted to convene through this discussion is a pledge for the state and for all of us to recognize with respect and with solidarity the hurt suffered by families of the missing, and to recognize and support their paths to secure their rights. Their actions are really building peace through innovation, solidarity, and strength. So their centrality is key. So moving to our third topic, we want to speak about what exactly are the rights of families of the missing, how accounting for missing persons secure those rights, and how that helps us in our society. So let's go into our final topic for discussion. We will then move to your questions.
So in relation to state obligations towards the families, we all humans are born with dignity and with inherent rights. The right to life, the right to be safe, the right to food, the right to health, the right to vote, the right to have impartial tribunals, the right not to be discriminated against, the right to family life, the right of freedom of expression, the right to be organized and associate, the right to be informed, and many more. States and governments are structures, and above anything are there to generate the conditions for us to realize those rights. When someone goes missing, their right to life is endangered, and states have an obligation to initiate prompt, adequate, and effective investigations. If something happens to you in the Netherlands, you go to the police, and the police will investigate what happened.
Yes. For example, when the MH17 plane crash happened over Ukraine, the life of 298 passengers from all nationalities, including Dutch passengers, was in danger. Many governments cooperated to conduct a thorough investigation into what happened. This investigation also entailed recovering, identifying, and returning the remains to the families. Also, the investigation looked into who had caused the plane to crash. This action by the state is what should happen at all times, but in many countries around the world, there is no political will, knowledge, or capacity to act. And this is why ICMP helps families to become organized to support the process. So let's explore what is the role of families during those investigations and what are their rights.
As we discussed, first and foremost, families have the right to report a missing person. And this report is essentially to know who the state should be looking for. Sometimes families are afraid to report to the authorities, and so ICMP and civil society actors work in generating conditions for trust to enable reporting of missing persons. Reporting is essential to consolidate records of who is missing. Genetic information that families may be able to provide also needs to be collected. Families are essential to encourage other families to provide this information. ICMP works in education and information programs to encourage this form of participation.
Yes. In addition, the data that families provide must be put to use to find the missing persons. It must be shared and compared with others, with the written and explicit consent of the families, and this is really important. Data should also be protected. We all have the right to privacy, and there should be mechanisms to ensure that our data and our privacy is protected. This is especially important because DNA reveals family relationships. It is essential that authorities work in a way that respect the right to privacy. Women are particularly affected if this privacy is breached. ICMP works in providing tools to families so they are aware about consent, the right to privacy, and in supporting authorities to ensure that this privacy is protected.
Through the investigation, families need to be kept informed about efforts. Families may also wish to observe excavations, ask questions from the authorities, and receive written reports. As information becomes available, authorities have the obligation to determine the following: where the missing person is, and to return, alive or dead, the person or their remains back to their families. To determine what happened to the person, how the disappearance happened, and if they died, what caused the death, and in which manner they died. And to determine if the disappearance was caused by a crime, who are those responsible for the crime?
Yes, Goran, these questions are what we call truth and justice. Accountability is an essential component when disappearances have happened as a consequence of a crime. Families may or may not demand justice immediately. Some of them are often focused on first having their loved one back, but many of them around the world call for justice. But states have an obligation to ensure that these crimes do not happen again. And fighting impunity is essential for all of us as a whole. None of us want to live in a society where someone can go missing and there are no answers. Efforts to locate and to identify missing persons are one essential component of accountability.
Families are also entitled to reparations and assistance. The assistance will help them with their immediate needs, and reparations can happen as compensation, rehabilitation, restitution, recognition, and measures to prevent disappearances again, to repair the harm that they may have suffered.
And let me add that there's also memory. Families at the individual level remember and commemorate their missing relatives. At the institutional and public levels, it is essential that the missing and what happened to them is remembered. This contributes to ensuring an accurate record that is part of every nation's history and to restore the dignity of those who disappeared.
These demands often happen in highly politicized contexts and require political action, legislation, financial investment. Let's look at the type of demands that families of the missing make. We will now hear from Ms. Semina Alekic, chairperson of the steering board of the Regional Coordination of Associations of Families of Missing Persons from the former Yugoslavia, and hear her address to the public on the International Day of the Disappeared in 2020. Sasha, would you please play the video?
Ja sam Semina Alekić, predsjedavajuća Upravnog odbora regionalne koordinacije Udruženja porodica nestalih osoba sa područja bivše Jugoslavije. Udruženja porodica nestalih osoba iz Bosne i Hercegovine, Hrvatske, Srbije, Crne Gore i Kosova putem regionalne koordinacije zajednički vrše pritisak i zagovaraju kod domaćih i međunarodnih institucija da se ubrza rješavanje pitanja nestalih osoba i da se omogući u potpunosti ostvarivanje prava porodica kako to u zakonima piše. Žalosno je da se nakon 25 godina po prestanku ratnih dejstava u državama koje su nastale na području bivše Jugoslavije još uvijek potražuje oko 10.900 osoba kojim treba da se vrati identitet, najveći broj je iz Bosne i Hercegovine preko 7.000. Da bi se proces ubrzao, apelujem na sve građane koji posjeduju bilo kakve informacije o potencijalnim lokacijama pojedinačnih ili masovnih grobnica, da ih proslijede institucijama ili udruženjima i sve one građane koji u svojoj bližoj porodici imaju nestalog srodnika, ukoliko nisu dali uzorke krvi, da ih daju kako bi se ubrzala identifikacija ekshumiranih posmrtnih ostataka. Tražimo od institucija u državama nastalim na području bivše Jugoslavije da u potpunosti primjenjuju sve potpisane međunarodne i međusobne sporazume, protokole, deklaracije i druga dokumenta, kao i u potpunu primjenu domaće zakonodavne regulative koja je dobrog sadržaja, samo što se ne primjenjuje, kako bi se ubrzao proces rješavanja sudbina nestalih, a porodice ostvarile svoje pravo. Problem nestalih osoba nije problem samo nas, porodica, to je problem svih porodica i građana, vlasti i politika u državama nastalim na području bivše Jugoslavije, jer rješavanje sudbina nestalih osoba doprinosi ekonomskom prosperitetu, izgradnji sigurnog okruženja i istinskog mira na ovim prostorima.
Thank you so much for your contribution. It's been fascinating. We're now going to have you leave the stage, and then you can join our virtual lab tour. So,
thank you. If I just may send one last message, if you don't mind,
yes,
for the audience today, because you said it's so large. We really want to say that we hope the voices of the families and the issues for discussions are giving you a look at the multiple layers of the interplay in the issue of the missing. And the next time you see them on social media or in front of your parliaments, please do join them, as solidarity is a powerful force.
Thank you. With that, it's time for the last part of our program. We're gonna head to the lab. So let's see if we can get my colleague John on stage. John, are you there? He's one floor below me. So let's see if we can get him on stage. Oh, here we have him. Welcome, John. Thank you for joining us. We're excited to be allowed to come and visit the lab, which is something that large crowds of 80 people from all over the world usually cannot do en masse. So thank you for this opportunity. Could you please tell us a bit about the lab and perhaps also why DNA is so important for accounting for missing persons?
Yes, thank you, Susanna. Well, welcome to all of you to the laboratory portion of the virtual tour. Today, I'm going to share with you how the ICMP uses the latest DNA technology to assist in the resolution of cases of missing persons. As Kathryne mentioned, the kinds of cases that the ICMP typically focuses on are those related to forced disappearance, war, irregular migration, and disasters, both natural and man-made. So why DNA? When someone goes missing, family members are the ones that usually make a report. As you have already heard, families of the missing are the primary focus of the ICMP to provide them with answers as to what happened to their loved one and to assist them in asserting their rights and obtaining justice. When an individual is found deceased, they may be identified by one or more methods depending on the circumstances, such as visual identification by next of kin, or a scientific method such as comparisons using dental records, fingerprints, or DNA. DNA has several advantages. Unlike visual identification, DNA is an objective scientific method, the results of which can be presented in court. This may be necessary in the future if criminal charges are brought forward. Also, in many cases, the human remains may have suffered damage or decomposition, often to the point of skeletonization, which limits the utility of other methods. But as you'll see, DNA can provide answers on even the very tiniest of fragments of bone. For the scientific methods of identification, a comparison is made. This might be dental or fingerprint records from the missing person being compared to the same records from the deceased person. Here are the features of DNA that make it such a useful tool. DNA is found in the nucleus of every cell in the body. DNA is the same throughout one's body, throughout one's life, and with the exception of identical twins, each person's DNA type is unique. DNA is passed down from children to from their parents, half coming from the mother and half from the father. So related individuals share a certain amount of DNA based on their relationship. Close family members such as parents, children, and siblings share more DNA with each other, and more distantly related individuals share less. So the overall way that we can use DNA to assist in the identification process is that we compare the DNA profiles from family members of a missing person with the DNA profiles from unidentified people to look for the sharing. And in this way, we can make a DNA match.
That's great. I think we have a little video that packs a lot of information into a short clip. Can we get that started, please?
Okay, yes, so just to introduce the video, to let you know, we analyzed two types of samples. There are reference samples from family members that are collected either blood or saliva, and bones from the unidentified person. I will talk you through the various processes that we use to extract and analyze DNA from bones, but the process for blood or saliva is very similar. There are a number of steps that are performed in the lab that I'll describe in a little more detail, along with the following video. Consider that this bone or these bones that you'll see were likely recovered from a mass grave, so they've been exposed to soil and other effects of the environment in which they were found. So, Sasha, if you could start the clip.
Staff and volunteers working with ICMP country programs collect blood or saliva samples from families of the missing. They use a collection kit that comprises a buccal swab, a lancet, and a special collection card. A small drop of blood from the fingertip or a small amount of saliva is placed on the card. The card is then processed at ICMP's DNA laboratory in The Hague, where DNA information is isolated from the sample and analyzed, and the resulting DNA profile submitted for matching. Samples from unidentified bodies, small portions of bone that have been sampled from skeletal remains, are sent to ICMP's laboratory in The Hague, where DNA is extracted and analyzed. ICMP is a world leader in isolating DNA from severely degraded bone samples, and has been able to do this in cases where bones have been badly burned, for example, that have been beyond the technical means of other laboratories. Each profile from either a family reference sample or a bone sample is uploaded to the IDMS, which searches for a match between DNA profiles. When a potential DNA match is found, all the data is again reviewed by DNA analysts before the submission of a formal report to ICMP's country partners.
So there's some really important, and it looks rather complex, scientific work going on in the lab. I was hoping that you could take us through it step by step so that people like me can understand it better.
So, as you can see, this individual is wearing what we call personal protective equipment, including mask, hairnet, gloves, lab coat. This PPE serves two purposes. The first is to protect them from any hazards associated with the evidence or the chemicals used during the testing, and also to protect the evidence from contamination with DNA from the analyst themselves. So in the first steps of the process, we call evidence reception. Evidence is received at the laboratory, and it's very important to document all the details, which includes a chain of custody, so we can count for the evidence at all points in the shipping, processing, and return. So maybe we'll stop the clip right there. And just to make the point about this chain of custody, this is extremely critical if we were to end up presenting this evidence in court, as we need to be able to account for the whereabouts of the evidence. One of the first things that we do is to assign a barcode, and that barcode follows the sample throughout the process, and that makes the information or the background information about the sample invisible to the staff. We take photographs and notes and detail the condition of the evidence so we have a clear record of what was received. So in this part that you were just watching, the outer surface of the bone was sanded, cut into small fragments, and then washed to remove any extraneous material. Then the bone fragments were put into a blender and they're ground into a fine powder. Okay, go ahead and roll the clip. You can see the powder there that's being emptied out of that the blender cup, and now the individual's getting all of the remaining pieces of bone off of the cap of that cup. And this individual is going to pour the bone powder into this tube, and after that we'll weigh the bone powder to see how much was recovered. So that's our starting material, is a finely ground bone powder that's about the consistency of flour. And the next step is to utilize chemical extraction or DNA extraction. And as you can see, this individual is pipetting liquid, is the extraction buffer, into the bone powder, mixing it up. And this extraction starts the process of purifying the DNA away from all of the other material that's present in the bone. She's processing the second sample right now. And then the next part of the process will be to place this mixture into an oven that's held at 56 degrees Celsius and incubated overnight in a rocking motion. And that helps to break up the cellular matrix, the bone matrix, and to separate the DNA away from everything else, like proteins, fats, other small molecules. So this is the incubation oven. And as I mentioned, this will proceed overnight and be the first part of the purification of DNA. In the second part, there's more chemicals added that, again, help purify and concentrate the DNA. And then what we will move on to is what's called DNA quantification. And so yeah, you can see the samples being rocked back and forth in this oven. Yes. So the DNA quantification step, as its name indicates, is the step at which we determine the quantity of DNA. Now, there isn't a lot of DNA present in bone, and especially when bones have been exposed to the environment and microbial activity, this leads to degradation of the DNA that's already present there. And in addition to determining how much DNA was recovered, we can also determine how much degradation occurred and how pure the DNA is. By that, I mean how free of any contaminating other material this DNA is. So it ends up in a small amount of clear liquid. It looks like water, if you will. And it would be the amount present in a few drops. And that's the starting material for the next step, which is called amplification. Amplification uses a process called PCR, or polymerase chain reaction. And PCR is something you may be familiar with if you've been tested for coronavirus, because it's the same basic scientific technique. And what PCR does is it makes copies of specific target regions in the DNA. And these target regions have been selected because they're highly variable between individuals, so that the resulting profile is distinct from profiles from other individuals, and we can tell one person apart from their DNA profile. After the amplification, the DNA profile is determined using computer software and fed into a database for matching purposes. And as I've mentioned previously, what the matching is looking at is the DNA profiles from the family members of the missing person arranged in the family tree. And that's being compared to the profiles of unidentified persons, or the profiles obtained from the bones, which you just saw. We use specialized software that will look for similarities in the DNA profiles that we would expect from closely related people. And in that way, we essentially pull a needle out of a haystack and look for that match that is found in between these two databases, database of missing persons and databases of unidentified persons. Now, it's very important that we express the confidence or the certainty of that match with statistics. The ICMP uses a 99.95% certainty threshold before we report on the results of a DNA match. And so that gives us a high level of confidence that the DNA found from the unidentified bone is related to the individuals represented in the profiles of the family members. Now, after the match, this report gets sent to what's called the medical legal authority in whatever country where the remains have originated. But DNA is just one of several scientific tools that can be used to determine the identity of an individual. However, it's not viewed alone, but in the context of other information that is available. So this would be, for example, when and where the missing person went missing, and when and where the remains were found. There's other information like sex, stature, age, medical and dental histories. And what the persons responsible for the legal identification, that is issuing a death certificate, do is they take into account all of the information, including the DNA results, to make the final determination of identity of that individual, as well as there can be a determination of the cause of death. And as I mentioned, these reports can be entered into courts that are looking into war crimes and things of that nature. So it's exceedingly important that we do our work correctly.
Great. So the work that you do in the lab results in matches then of DNA samples. And it's the authorities, the national authorities, that do the actual identifications and are in touch with the families. Now, throughout this, we've heard a little bit about privacy. There's a lot of concern because you work with people's actual genetic material. They must be very concerned about their privacy. What steps do you take to ensure that the privacy is not violated?
Yes, the ICMP takes the issue of privacy very seriously. And this includes two kinds of privacy. One is related to the personal information that we obtain when we take the reference sample. And it also refers to the genetic privacy of the sample itself. When a person is reported missing, we collect information about the missing person, but we also collect information about the donor of the DNA. So how they're related, their name, all their personal information, that's entered into a database, the IDMS, which you've heard about. And we have strict policies here at the ICMP that restrict access to this information and keep it secure while it's in our custody. And as a treaty-based international organization, the ICMP has immunities that protect this data from governmental interference. So in other words, we take the privacy very seriously, and we aren't affected by changes in government or changes in governmental policies that would make this data available. If that data is to be used in court, that is another consent that is given by the donor. So there's two layers of consent. One is to provide the sample, and it's consented as to what the purpose will be, which is to find their loved one. And then the second layer of consent, which they're independent, would be, could we use that information in a court of law?
Great. Thank you. I think we have a little, just a 1 minute, it's actually less than 1 minute, little clip explaining about privacy, however you want to pronounce it. So let's play that, and then we'll start answering the questions that we have received in the question block here. So Sasha, if you can get the little privacy clip going.
Throughout this process, ICMP ensures that the information provided by families of the missing is protected. The process itself is blind, whereby DNA samples are processed under an ICMP barcode. Thereafter, the barcode, rather than a name, is associated with the DNA profile. At the stage of reporting a DNA match, the personal information is retrieved and associated back to the case in question. ICMP undertakes not to share this information without the consent of the individual who provided it. ICMP's computer servers are physically removed from countries where they could be compromised. ICMP is protected from all forms of government coercion by its status as an international organization, which entails a series of privileges and immunities. This means that families of the missing can provide their genetic information with complete confidence that it will be used exclusively for the purposes of identifying a missing loved one.
So that's to explain our very strict approach to protect the privacy of the people that we work with, both the missing persons and the families. Well, we've gone a bit over time. Thank you everyone for staying with us for so long. We've been here now for almost 2 hours. We're really excited that you wanted to join us today. We hope you will follow us on social media, and we also put an email in the chat box. If you have more questions, you can drop them our way. Check out our website, check us out on Facebook, check us out on Twitter, on LinkedIn. Our handle is @the-ICMP, all in one word. Thank you so much for coming, everyone, and have a good evening, morning, afternoon, or whatever time it is in your part of the world. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Bye.